At 3:17 in the morning on January 15th, 1945, I became a criminal. The United States Army Field Manual, Section 314.7, explicitly states that anti-aircraft assets shall not be deployed forward of the infantry line. I drove mine straight into the teeth of a Banzai charge. 300 men witnessed my insubordination. By sunrise, I would be either court-martialed or dead, but the 482 soldiers who lived through that night, they called me a hero. The truth is always in war was more complicated. My name is Frank Kowalski. This is the story of how a useless gun became a legend and how doing the right thing cost me everything. The smell of machine oil was the smell of home. My father, Stefan Kowalski, worked the assembly line at the Ford Rouge plant in Detroit, and from the time I could walk, he brought me to that cathedral of American industry. The sound of pneumatic hammers and the glow of molten steel were my lullabies. My father had immigrated from Warsaw in 1922 with nothing but his hands and his faith. He believed in two things, absolutely the Virgin Mary and the perfection of machines. Frankie, he would say, his accent, thick as kielbasa. Machine don't lie to you. Machine don't get drunk. Machine don't get tired. You treat machine right. Machine treat you right. Always. I was 22 years old when the machine failed him. A casting die on the assembly line had a hairline fracture that no one caught during inspection. When the hydraulic press came down, the die shattered. 40 tons of force and a cloud of shrapnel. My father was standing 3 feet away. He died before the foreman could reach him. The funeral was small. My mother, Helena, sat in the front pew of St. Florian's Church, her rosary beads clicking through her fingers like Morse code. And I understood something fundamental about machines that my father never admitted. Machines do fail. They break, they kill. But unlike men, machines can be perfected. They can be understood. They can be controlled. My mother gave me that rosary the day I enlisted. It was December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. The recruiting station on Michigan Avenue had a line around the block, young men with fire in their eyes and no idea what fire actually looked like. I stood in that line for 3 hours, and when the sergeant asked me what I wanted to do, I said one word: machines. They sent me to Camp Edwards in Massachusetts for anti-aircraft artillery training. That's where I met her, the M45 Maxim mount. 4 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns mounted on a powered turret. She weighed 2,000 pounds without ammunition. She could traverse 360 degrees in 4.2 seconds. She could elevate from flat to 90 degrees before you could blink. And when all 4 guns fired together, she produced a sound that made grown men weep. The other recruits thought I was crazy while they were drinking and playing cards. I was in the motor pool. I would test the traverse motors 50 times a day. I would lubricate every joint count, every round, memorize every tolerance and specification. The training sergeant started calling me the mechanic. The other men called me worse things, but I didn't care. I had made a promise to my father's ghost. My machine would never fail anyone. In October of 1944, we shipped out to the Pacific, the 209th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. Destination classified, objective shoot down Japanese planes. Reality, by the time we arrived, there weren't any planes left to shoot. The landing at Lingayen Gulf on Luzon Island in the Philippines happened on January 9th, 1945. We came ashore 3 days later after the infantry had already secured the beachhead. The Navy had pounded the coast for weeks. The Army Air Corps had bombed every airfield within 200 miles. Japanese air power in the Philippines was finished. They had maybe 150 operational aircraft left in the entire island chain, and most of those were being saved for kamikaze runs against the fleet, which meant that the 209th AAA battalion had nothing to shoot at except clouds. We set up our positions 3 miles inland on a muddy road that connected the beach supply dumps to the forward infantry positions. My half-track, officially designated M16 multiple gun motor carriage call sign Baker 3, became the world's most expensive roadblock. We sat there with our 4 guns pointed at an empty sky, listening to the war happen somewhere else. My crew consisted of 3 men, and I loved them like brothers, even though they drove me insane. Private Eddie Sullivan was my driver. Boston Irish with the South Boston accent so thick you could spread it on toast. 22 years old, perpetually smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes that he got from his sister's care packages. Eddie had lost his older brother Patrick at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, killed when German panzers rolled over American light tanks like they were made of cardboard. Eddie volunteered for anything that would let him kill fascists, but the army put him in a truck. He handled disappointment by chain smoking and making jokes that weren't funny. His favorite phrase was unfucking believable, which he applied to everything from cold rations to enemy artillery. Corporal Marcus Hayes was my gunner, Chicago-born South Side raised, and one of the few black soldiers in an integrated anti-aircraft unit. The army was still segregated in most branches, but AA artillery was technical enough that they needed skilled men regardless of color. Marcus had been a carpenter before the war, building houses on the north side. He had the steady hands of a craftsman and the eyes of a sniper. He could look at a target 1,000 yards away and tell you exactly how much to lead it. He spoke maybe 10 words a day, but every word counted. He sat in that gunner's seat like it was a church pew, hands on the joysticks, absolutely calm. Private First Class Danny Rossi was my loader, and he was a liar. His paper said he was James Wilson, 20 years old from Brooklyn, but his dog tags were too shiny. His story had too many holes, and he called Marcus Sir, even though Marcus was enlisted just like him. I knew he was underage. I knew he was using someone else's name, and I knew exactly whose name it was because one night in the barracks, I saw him holding a Bronze Star citation. Corporal Anthony Rossi, killed in action, Omaha Beach, June 6th, 1944. I should have reported him, but when I looked at that kid, 17 years old, pretending to be his dead brother, I saw something I recognized: grief, rage, the need to make a death mean something. So I kept my mouth shut, and Danny Rossi loaded ammunition like his life depended on it because in his mind it did. The infantry hated us. We were parked 200 yards behind their foxholes, fat and happy in our steel bathtub while they rotted in the mud. The men of the 25th Infantry Division had been fighting since Guadalcanal. They were exhausted. Their boots were disintegrating from jungle rot. Their eyes were yellow from malaria suppression pills. They lived in holes filled with water and watched their friends die from snipers they never saw. And when they looked back at us sitting high in our turret scanning an empty sky, they saw tourists. They saw rear echelon motherfuckers. They saw men wasting gasoline and ammunition while real soldiers did the real work. Private Joseph Marconi led the mockery. Joey was from South Philadelphia, 23 years old, and mean as a junkyard dog. He had a face like a hatchet and a disposition to match. Every morning when we drove past his foxhole position to check our perimeter, he would spit tobacco juice on our tracks. Every single morning. Long brown stream hitting the steel with a wet slap. Then he would grin at us with teeth stained the color of rust. "Hey, bird boy," he would shout. "See any pigeons today? Maybe a fucking sparrow?" His buddies would laugh. They had jokes for every occasion. When we stopped to refuel, they would ask if we needed directions to the war. When we test-fired the guns, they would applaud sarcastically and shout, "Nice fireworks show." When we drove past carrying supplies, they would throw mud at the truck and call us the ice cream truck because we looked so clean. On January 13th, 2 days before everything changed, Joey Marconi walked right up to my position and said it to my face. I was performing my daily maintenance check. Traverse motors, elevation, motors, charging handles, belt feeds. Everything had to be perfect. Joey appeared out of the jungle trail, uniform black with mud rifle slung over his shoulder, looking at me like I was something he scraped off his boot. "You know what you are, Polak," he said. No preamble, no greeting, just pure Philadelphia venom. I kept working on the traverse motor. "I'm a sergeant. You want to tell me something private, you do it with proper respect." "Respect," Joey laughed. It was not a happy sound. "My buddies are dying in them foxholes, real men fighting real Japs, and you're sitting pretty in your steel bathtub looking at clouds. You ain't a soldier, you're a fucking tourist." I stood up slowly. Joey was 5'8" and maybe 140 pounds. I was 6'1" and 190, but size didn't matter. What mattered was that he was right, and we both knew it. "Private Marconi," I said quietly, "I follow my orders. You follow yours. We all go home when this is done." "Orders," he spat again, hit my boot. "Your orders are bullshit. You got the most powerful gun on this island and you're pointing it at nothing. You're useless. Worse than useless. You're taking up space that real soldiers could use." He walked away before I could respond. Eddie, watching from the driver's seat, shook his head. "Unfucking believable," he muttered. But the worst part was that Joey Marconi was absolutely right. I had 4 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute. Together, they could put out 2,000 rounds per minute. Each round carried 13,000 foot-pounds of energy. I had done the math in my head 100 times. One quad 50 mount had the firepower of 200 riflemen. We could hold a line against a regiment, but the manual said no. Section 314.7, anti-aircraft assets shall be preserved for air defense. Period. No exceptions. No creative reinterpretation. The experts in Manila said that bringing an M16 to a jungle fight was suicide. The vehicle had thin armor. A rifle bullet could punch through the cab. A mortar shell in the open bed would kill the crew. The jungle was too dense visibility, too limited threat, too close. They said we would be blind trapped and dead, so we sat in the rear. Preserved, protected, useless. Every night I could hear the war, artillery flashes on the horizon, flares drifting over the tree line like fallen stars. Sometimes I could hear the small arms fire, the rattle and crack of rifles and machine guns, and I knew that men were dying 300 yards away while I sat on top of a weapon that could save them. My mother's rosary hung around my neck under my uniform. I could feel it against my skin, warm from my body heat. Sometimes I would touch it and think about my father's words. "Machine don't lie. Machine don't quit. Machine don't break if you treat it right." But what about the men? What happens when the machine is ready, but the men who control it are ordered to do nothing? On January 14th at 1900 hours, Captain Robert Clayton called me to his command post. Clayton was regular Army West Point, class of 32. Virginia gentleman with the accent to prove it. He had studied under Patton at Fort Benning and believed in the chain of command the way other men believed in God. But he also had eyes. He could see what was happening to his infantry. The command post was a tent behind a supply dump. Inside was a folding table, a map of Luzon, and a bottle of bourbon that Clayton never touched. He was standing over the map when I entered, and he didn't look up. "Close the flap, Sergeant." I did. The tent went dim, single kerosene lamp throwing shadows on the canvas. "I've been reading reports," Clayton said, his finger traced positions on the map. "Tarawa, Saipan, Pileliu. You know what they all have in common? Banzai charges, sir. Banzai charges," he repeated. "Human wave attacks. Thousands of men running straight into machine gun fire, willing to die, trying to break our lines through sheer weight of bodies. You know what stopped them." I said nothing. I knew where this was going. "Quad 50s. Clayton said. "Every single after-action report mentions them. One half-track holds a line against a regiment. Crew of 4 men does the work of a battalion, but it's unauthorized. Against doctrine. If a commander orders it and it fails, both men hang. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Sergeant?" "No, sir." Clayton finally looked at me. His eyes were tired, gray, old, beyond his 35 years. "I'm not telling you anything," he said. "I'm just a man reading reports out loud. I'm just a man who lost 97 soldiers at Kasserine Pass because doctrine said light tanks can't engage panzers head on, so we had to wait for proper armor support while Germans rolled over my boys like they were made of paper. I watched them die, Sergeant. I watched them burn because I followed the manual." He poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a tin cup, didn't drink it, just looked at it. "I will not watch my men die because of a manual ever again," he said quietly, "but I also will not order a man to commit an unauthorized act." Do you understand what I'm not saying, Sergeant Kowalski? I understood perfectly. Clayton was giving me permission through deniability. If I acted on my own initiative and succeeded, he would claim he ordered it. If I failed, he would deny everything. It was a bet on my judgment, a transfer of responsibility, a gift and a curse. "Yes, sir," I said. "I understand." "Good. Dismissed." I was at the tent flap when he spoke again. "Sergeant, your father worked the Ford plant, correct?" "Yes, sir." "My father worked a cotton plantation in Virginia. Used to tell me that the difference between a good tool and a great tool is the man who wields it. You're a good man, Sergeant. I trust you to be a great tool if the time comes." I left the tent with my hands shaking, not from fear, from possibility, from the weight of a choice I hadn't yet made but knew was coming. Frank Kowalski didn't know it yet, but Captain Clayton had just given him the keys to a kingdom of fire, and in 9 hours he would use them. At 2100 hours, I gathered my crew at the half-track. Eddie was smoking, Marcus was cleaning his sidearm, Danny was staring at nothing, which was his usual state. The jungle around us was loud with insects and distant artillery. "We're repacking the ammo," I said. Eddie looked up. "Sarge, we just packed it yesterday. Standard AA load, 4 AP to 1 tracer. We're changing the ratio 1 to 1. 50% tracers." Marcus stopped cleaning his pistol. That got his attention. "Sergeant, that's a ground fighting load. We're anti-aircraft." "I know what we are, Corporal. I also know what we might need to be. Now help me repack these tombstones." The ammunition for the Quad 50 came in curved metal boxes that the crews called tombstones because of their shape. Each tombstone held 200 rounds linked together in a belt. Standard anti-aircraft doctrine called for armor-piercing rounds to punch through aircraft engines with occasional tracers to help the gunner see where he was shooting, maybe 1 tracer for every 5 rounds. But if you're shooting at a target on the ground in the pitch black of a jungle night, you can't see where your bullets are going. You're firing blind. You need every round to burn bright so you can walk your fire onto the target. You need a stream of light you can see and adjust. We spent 2 hours repacking every belt, pulling the standard loads apart, replacing every other round with a tracer. The tracers had a small pyrotechnic charge in the base that ignited when fired, creating a streak of burning magnesium. In daylight, they were mostly useless. In darkness, they were everything. Danny worked in silence for an hour before he spoke. "Sarge, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead, Private." "You know, don't you, about me?" I kept working. Didn't look at him. "Know what?" "That I'm not Jimmy Wilson, that I used my brother's papers." Eddie and Marcus both stopped working. The jungle got very quiet. "What's your real name?" I asked. Danny Rossi. I'm 17. I'll be 18 in April. Tony was my older brother. He died at Omaha Beach. I couldn't let him die for nothing, Sarge. I had to do something. His voice broke. This kid, this baby-faced liar who had somehow made it through basic training and across the Pacific Ocean was crying in front of his entire crew. I put down the ammunition belt I was working on and looked at him. "Private Rossi," I said, "your brother was a brave man. He earned that Bronze Star fighting for his country. But he didn't die so you could die too. He died so you could live. You understand me. You honor him by staying alive, by being the best soldier you can be, by loading these guns when the time comes and not stopping until I tell you to stop. That's how you honor your brother." Danny wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, nodded, picked up another belt and kept working. Eddie cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, kid, you load ammo better than any 20-year-old I ever met." Marcus said nothing, just reached over and squeezed Danny's shoulder once. That was Marcus's version of a speech. We finished repacking at 2300 hours. 4,800 rounds, 24 tombstones, enough ammunition to fire continuously for 2.4 minutes if we didn't let the barrels cool, enough firepower to stop a regiment if we ever got the chance to use it. The jungle changed after midnight. The insects went quiet. The birds stopped calling. Even the artillery on the horizon seemed to pause, as if the entire island was holding its breath. Veterans of the Pacific War knew that sound, the sound of silence. It meant the Japanese were moving. At 100 hours, I tried to write a letter to my mother, sat in the commander's seat with a flashlight and a piece of paper, and tried to find words that wouldn't make her worry. It was impossible. Dear Ma, I'm sorry I haven't written more. I wanted to tell you I finally got to use Papa's skills. You remember how he taught me to listen to machines, to hear when a bearing's going bad, when a belt's too loose. I do that with this gun every day. I think Papa would be proud. I stopped writing. The words felt wrong, too formal, too distant. I crumpled the paper and started again. Ma, the boys here don't think much of me. They think I'm hiding behind this gun while they do the real fighting. Maybe they're right. I don't know anymore. The manual says I'm supposed to shoot at airplanes. But Ma, there aren't any airplanes. There's just boys in the mud, scared and tired, and I have this beautiful machine that could help them, but I'm not allowed. Papa died because the machine failed him. What if my machine could save somebody and I don't use it? Isn't that worse? I folded the letter and put it in my breast pocket. I wouldn't mail it, but I needed it close. Needed her close. Needed to remember why I was here. At 300 hours, I did something I had never done before. I lowered the quad 50. The 4 barrels designed to track Japanese Zeros at 300 miles per hour now pointed at the jungle floor. Horizontal. Flat. Ready. Eddie noticed immediately. Sarge, what are you doing? Getting ready. Ready for what? There's nothing out there but trees. I didn't answer. I just stood in the commander's position, hands on the turret ring, looking at the darkness ahead. My mother's rosary was warm against my chest. The metal of the gun was cold under my hands. Somewhere out in that jungle, something was coming. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before it breaks. Marcus checked the ammunition feeds one more time, ran his hands over the butterfly triggers, adjusted his seat. Danny stood next to the stacked tombstones, hands shaking slightly. I put my hand on his shoulder. You're going to do fine, Danny. Your brother's watching. Make him proud. The kid nodded, tried to smile, failed. At 0310 hours, my radio crackled, Captain Clayton's voice tight and controlled. All units, this is actual. Intelligence reports large-scale enemy movement toward Sector 7. Estimated strength regimental plus. All positions stand to acknowledge. I keyed the handset. Baker 3 acknowledges. Regimental strength. That meant at least 1,000 men, maybe 2,000. All of them moving through the jungle in silence, getting into position for one coordinated strike. I had read the intelligence reports. I knew how the Japanese fought on Luzon. They didn't probe, they didn't skirmish. They gathered every available man, issued the sake rations tied on the ceremonial headbands, and charged straight into the American guns. They called it the shattering of the jewel, honorable death, glorious sacrifice. They were coming, not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. And in 5 minutes, Joey Marconi and every other man who had called me a tourist was going to find out what this useless gun could actually do. At 0315 hours, the jungle erupted with sound. Not gunfire, not explosions, something worse. The sound of 1,800 human voices screaming the same word in unison. Banzai. Eddie looked at me through the driver's slit eyes wide. Sarge. I grabbed the intercom. My voice was surprisingly calm. Eddie, put it in gear. Reverse. No. Forward. Get us to that ridge. Eddie stared at me like I had lost my mind. Driving a thin-skinned half-track directly into a Banzai charge was suicide. It was madness. It was against every regulation in the book. But he saw something in my eyes. Something that told him this wasn't a debate. Fuck it, Eddie said. Let's go. He slammed the shifter into first gear and stomped on the throttle. The half-track lurched forward, tracks churning, mud engine roaring like an angry god. We rumbled out of the shadows and onto the supply road, headlights off, moving toward the sound of screaming men. The retreating infantrymen stopped and stared. Some of them waved their arms, shouting at us to turn back. Some of them just stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. The birdwatcher wasn't running away. It was driving straight into the throat of hell. I stood in the commander's seat, fully exposed to the night air wind in my face. I touched my mother's rosary one more time, then I tapped Marcus on the helmet. Get ready. Don't aim, just point. Marcus gripped the joysticks. His thumbs hovered over the butterfly triggers. The electric motors whined as he traversed the turret left and right, testing the motion. The 4 heavy barrels bobbed up and down like the heads of cobras looking for a strike. We were 50 yards from the breach in the American line when the Japanese soldiers saw us. They stopped bayoneting wounded men in foxholes and looked up. They saw a strange boxy vehicle lumbering toward them. They didn't know what it was. To them, it probably looked like a lost supply truck. They raised their rifles. They laughed. They thought it was a gift. They thought it was another easy kill. They started running toward us, screaming their war cry, bayonets fixed, confident that their momentum was unstoppable. They were wrong. They were about to meet the meat chopper, and the jungle would never forget. The sound started as a low rumble like distant thunder rolling across the Philippine mountains. Then it became voices. Hundreds of voices chanting in unison, the syllables rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Then it became a roar, a wall of sound that physically pressed against your eardrums and made your chest vibrate. 1,800 men screaming the same word over and over, building in volume and fury until it drowned out everything else. Banzai, Banzai, Banzai. The word meant 10,000 years, a salute to the emperor, a declaration of immortality, but here in the mud and darkness of Luzon, it was a scream of death. It was the sound of men who had already died in their hearts running toward their physical end with absolute conviction. Joey Marconi was in his foxhole 150 yards from the tree line when the first wave emerged. He had been dozing, exhausted from 3 days of constant patrol when the chanting started. Now he was wide awake, M1 Garand in his hand, staring at something his mind refused to accept. The jungle was emptying. The tree line, which had been dark and silent, was now vomiting brown uniformed figures into the clearing. Not dozens, not hundreds, a solid wall of human beings stretching left and right as far as the flares illuminated. They were running at full sprint, bayonets, fixed rifles held high, faces twisted in expressions that were beyond rage, beyond fear, something transcendent and terrible. Joey raised his Garand, sighted on the chest of a Japanese soldier 50 yards away, squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The soldier went down. Joey shifted aim, fired again. Another man fell, again. The M1's distinctive ping as the 8-round clip ejected. All around him, every foxhole was firing. The American line had erupted in a continuous crackling roar. The Browning automatic rifles were hammering out their deeper rhythm. The heavy machine guns were thumping their steady beat. Tracers were cutting red and green lines through the darkness. It looked like the 4th of July. It sounded like the end of the world. The first wave of the Japanese charge hit that wall of bullets and collapsed. Bodies piled up in heaps. Men were cut down mid-stride, tumbling into the mud, creating obstacles that should have stopped the attack cold. Joey fumbled a fresh clip into his Garand, slapped the bolt forward, looked up, expecting to see the enemy retreating. Instead, he saw the second wave running over the backs of the first. They were using their own dead as stepping stones, literally running across the bodies of their fallen comrades, using corpses as cover, maintaining momentum. When a man was hit, the man behind him didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, just kept running. They were closing the distance, 70 yards, 60, 50. Joey's hands were shaking as he loaded his third clip. This wasn't how war was supposed to work. You shoot a man, he falls, his friends get scared and retreat. That was the natural order. But these men weren't natural. They weren't stopping. They weren't even slowing down. A soldier took a round in the shoulder and kept running, rifle in one hand, bayonet pointing forward like a spear. Another was hit in the leg and went down, crawling, still moving toward the American line, still screaming that word. 40 yards, 30 yards, 20 yards. The limitations of the American weapons began to show. The M1 Garand is a magnificent rifle, semi-automatic, accurate, reliable, but it only holds 8 rounds. When that clip is empty, you have to eject it, fumble in your bandolier for a fresh one, slam it into the receiver, and slap the bolt forward. In a normal firefight, this takes maybe 3 seconds. In a Banzai charge, 3 seconds is an eternity. While Joey was reloading, the Japanese were covering 20 yards. The machine guns were suffering worse. The heavy water-cooled M1917 SS were firing so continuously that the water in their cooling jackets was boiling. Steam hissed from the valves. The gunners were screaming for more water, more ammunition, more time. But time was the one thing they didn't have. At 18 minutes past 3 in the morning, the center of the American line failed. A squad of Japanese soldiers armed with satchel charges and Type 97 grenades made it to the main machine gun pit. There was a series of sharp explosions. The rhythmic thumping of the guns stopped. The screaming got louder. Then the wet, horrible sounds of bayonets and entrenching tools being used at close range. The anchor was gone. The line began to buckle. Joey saw it happen, saw the men on his left scrambling out of their foxholes, running back toward the secondary positions, saw the Japanese pouring through the gap like water through a broken dam. He fired his last rounds, dropped his rifle, grabbed his bayonet, and realized with absolute clarity that he was about to die. Then he heard the engine. The M16 half-track weighed 9 tons, fully loaded. It had a White 160A X6-cylinder engine that produced 147 horsepower. In first gear on flat ground, it could manage maybe 15 miles per hour. It was not designed for speed. It was designed for stability, for providing a steady platform for the guns. But when Eddie Sullivan slammed the throttle to the floor and aimed it at the breach in the American line, it sounded like a freight train. The half-track burst out of the shadows onto the supply road tracks, churning mud exhaust, bellowing black smoke. The retreating infantrymen stopped and stared. Some of them shouted warnings, some just stood frozen. One sergeant actually threw his helmet on the ground in disbelief. The bird watcher, the useless tourist truck that had sat in the rear for 3 weeks doing nothing, was driving straight into the teeth of hell. Frank Kowalski stood in the commander's position, fully exposed above the armored cab. The wind tore at his uniform. Bullets were already snapping past high and wild as Japanese soldiers spotted the vehicle and opened fire. He didn't duck, didn't flinch. He was looking ahead at the mass of enemy soldiers swarming over the American foxholes, calculating distance and angles with the cold precision his father had taught him. Marcus Hayes sat in the gunner's seat, below hands on the joysticks, thumbs resting on the butterfly triggers. His face was completely calm. He looked like a man sitting in church. The electric traverse motors hummed as he tested the controls one more time. Left, right, up, down. The 4 barrels moved in perfect synchronization, smooth as silk, responsive as thought. In the back, Danny Rossi stood among the stacked tombstones, hands already blistered from the earlier repacking work. His face was white. He was breathing too fast, hyperventilating on the edge of panic. But his hands were moving automatically, checking the belt feeds, making sure everything was ready. Eddie drove with his face pressed against the armored slit, one hand on the wheel, one hand on the shifter, a lucky strike somehow still clamped between his teeth. He was muttering under his breath, not praying, just a continuous stream of his favorite phrase, unfucking believable, unfucking believable, unfucking believable. They were 100 yards from the Japanese breakthrough when Frank tapped his helmet microphone. Marcus, you see them. I see them, Sergeant. 100 yards, closing to 50. Wait for my mark. Yes, Sergeant. The Japanese soldiers were busy with their victory. Some were bayoneting wounded Americans in the foxholes. Some were throwing grenades into the command tents. Some were stripping weapons and ammunition from the dead. They were inside the American perimeter. They had broken through. They were winning. Then they noticed the half-track. At first they seemed confused. It was just a truck, a boxy, ungainly vehicle that looked like it had taken a wrong turn. Some of them laughed. Some raised their rifles casually as if this was target practice. An officer, visible by his sword, was shouting orders, probably telling his men to destroy the vehicle and get back to the attack. 40 or 50 Japanese soldiers turned toward the M16 and began running. They were confident. They had just shattered an American infantry line. What was one truck going to do 75 yards? 50 yards, 40 yards. Frank could see their faces now, could see the expressions of triumph, of bloodlust, of absolute certainty, could see the officer with the gold teeth screaming encouragement, could see the young soldier couldn't have been more than 19, bayonet held high, running faster than the others. 30 yards. Frank tapped Marcus's helmet. Now. Marcus squeezed both triggers. The world ended. There is no way to adequately describe the sound of 4 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously at maximum cyclic rate. The human ear is not designed to process it. Individual gunshots create a crack, a bang, a discrete sound event that your brain can identify and catalog. But when 4 heavy machine guns are each firing 850 rounds per minute, slightly out of sync with each other, your brain stops hearing individual shots. It hears something else entirely. It sounds like canvas being ripped. Enormous sheets of heavy canvas being torn apart by invisible hands, but amplified 1,000 times, amplified until the sound becomes a physical force. Men 100 yards away felt it in their chests, felt their ribs vibrate, felt their lungs compress. The sound didn't just travel through the air, it traveled through the ground, through the metal of weapons, through the bones of everyone close enough to hear it. But the sound was secondary to the light, because Frank had loaded 50% tracer rounds. The Quad 50 didn't fire bullets in the conventional sense. It fired a solid beam of red fire. Each tracer round had a small pyrotechnic charge in its base that ignited on firing, creating a streak of burning magnesium. With every other round being a tracer, and 4 guns firing 2,000 rounds per minute combined, the result was a continuous stream of light. It looked like a laser, like something from a science fiction movie that wouldn't exist for another 40 years. In the pitch darkness of the jungle night, illuminated only by flickering flares, that beam of red fire became the only thing that mattered. It was brighter than the flares, brighter than the muzzle flashes from rifles. It painted everything it touched in shifting crimson light, like the jungle was on fire from the inside. The first row of Japanese soldiers didn't fall. They were thrown backward. A 50 caliber round weighs 650 grains and travels at 3,000 feet per second. When it hits a human body, the kinetic energy transfer is catastrophic. The round doesn't just punch a hole, it transfers enough force to literally arrest forward momentum and reverse it. The leading edge of the Japanese charge was lifted off their feet and hurled backward into the second rank. Bodies collided, men stumbled, the organized wave became a chaotic tangle of limbs and weapons. Marcus traversed the turret left, the electric motors screamed. The beam of red fire swept across the clearing like a scythe cutting wheat. Where it touched the ground, mud exploded upward in geysers. Where it touched trees, bark, and wood chips flew in all directions. Where it touched men, they simply vanished into the darkness. The physics were obscene. Each gun was delivering 850 rounds per minute. Each round carried 13,000 foot-pounds of energy. Together, the 4 guns were projecting 52,000 foot-pounds of energy every second into a target area the size of a football field. It wasn't a gunfight. It was industrial demolition. It was a machine designed to destroy aluminum aircraft turned loose on human flesh. The Japanese charge stopped, not slowed, not disrupted, stopped. The forward momentum that had carried them over their own dead through American machine gun fire across 100 yards of open ground under continuous fire, that momentum hit the wall of 50 caliber rounds and ceased to exist. Men were running at full sprint one moment and flying backward the next. The laws of physics were more powerful than the laws of Bushido. Marcus swept the turret right, back across the clearing. The beam of tracers cut a horizontal line through the night. Men who had taken cover behind the bodies of their fallen comrades found that 50 caliber rounds don't stop for corpses. The rounds punched through dead bodies, through living bodies, through the tree trunks behind them, and kept going. There was no cover. There was no safe place. There was only the beam, and everything the beam touched died. Inside the half-track, the scene was chaos incarnate. The vibration was so intense that Frank had to grip the turret ring with both hands to avoid having his teeth rattled loose. The floor was rapidly filling with hot brass shell casings. Every time a round fired, it ejected a brass casing the size of a banana. With 4 guns firing, these casings were pouring out of the ejection chutes in a metallic waterfall. They clattered onto the steel floor, rolled around, piled up, burning hot, filling the fighting compartment. The smell was overpowering. Burnt gunpowder, hot oil, the ozone stench of the electric motors working overtime, and underneath it all, something else, something organic and terrible that Frank tried not to think about. The smoke from the muzzles was billowing back into the cab, thick and acrid, stinging eyes coating faces in a layer of black soot. Danny Rossi was moving like a machine. His assigned task was the most physically demanding job in the crew. Each tombstone ammunition can weigh nearly 100 pounds fully loaded. At maximum cyclic rate, the 4 guns would empty a set of cans in approximately 20 seconds. That meant Danny had to unlatch the empty cans, throw them to the floor, grab fresh cans, heave them up onto the mounts, lock them in place, and feed the belts into the receivers, all while the turret was spinning wildly, all while the truck was vibrating like an earthquake, all while enemy soldiers were trying to kill him. His hands were already bleeding. The hot metal of the gun mounts was burning his palms. His back was screaming from the repetitive lifting, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. His rhythm was mechanical. Unlatch, toss, lift, lock, feed. Unlatch, toss, lift, lock, feed. His lips were moving, and if anyone could have heard him over the roar of the guns, they would have heard him saying the same thing over and over. I'm sorry, Tony. I'm sorry, Tony. I'm sorry, Tony. He wasn't sure if he was apologizing for using his brother's name or for being terrified or for still being alive when Tony wasn't. Maybe all three. But his hands kept moving and the guns kept firing, and that was all that mattered. Out in the mud, Joey Marconi had stopped running. He was standing in the open 50 yards behind the half-track, staring at something his brain couldn't process. The Japanese charge that had been about to overrun his position, that had broken through the American line, that had seemed unstoppable, was disintegrating, not retreating, not falling back in good order, disintegrating like ice thrown into a furnace. The beam of red tracers was erasing them. That was the only word that fit. Not killing, not stopping, erasing. Where the beam touched, men ceased to exist. The vegetation around them was being destroyed too. The thick jungle grass that grew 6 feet high and could hide a company of soldiers was being mowed down to bare mud. The vines that choked the trees were being severed. The trees themselves were being stripped of their bark, their branches, their leaves. Joey watched a palm tree, easily a foot thick at the base, take the full focus of the Quad 50's fire for perhaps 3 seconds. The tree didn't fall immediately. First, the bark exploded away in chunks. Then the outer wood began to splinter. Then the entire trunk simply shattered, toppling sideways with a crack like a cannon shot. The stump that remained looked like it had been chewed by a giant animal. The visibility was improving. That was the strangest thing. When the battle had started, you couldn't see more than 10 or 15 feet into the jungle because of the undergrowth. Now, in the flickering light of the tracers, Joey could see 50 yards, 60. The half-track wasn't just killing the enemy, it was landscaping the island. It was creating clear fields of fire where none had existed. It was removing cover, removing concealment, removing every advantage the Japanese had used to get close. The Japanese officers realized they were in a killing box. They started screaming orders, trying to get their men to flank, to move left and right, to get out of the cone of fire. They thought the half-track was like a tank slow to traverse, only able to face one direction at a time. They thought if they moved fast enough to the sides, they could get into its blind spot. They were catastrophically wrong. Marcus saw the movement on the left flank. A group of maybe 30 Japanese soldiers breaking away from the main body, running hard for the deeper jungle, trying to circle around. Marcus didn't have to crank a wheel or shout for help. He just twitched his left wrist. The electric motors howled. The entire 2,000-pound turret snapped 90 degrees to the left in less than a second. The beam of tracers whipped around with it cutting through the darkness like a searchlight. The flanking squad was caught in the open. They didn't have time to dive for cover, didn't have time to raise their weapons. The beam touched them and they went down in a tangle of limbs and equipment. Marcus snapped the turret 180 degrees to the right. There was another group trying the same maneuver on that side. Same result. The traverse speed was faster than a human could run. There were no blind spots. There were no safe angles. The birdwatcher saw everything. Something broke in the American infantry at that moment. Some psychological barrier between observer and participant. They realized they weren't watching anymore. They were part of this. The half-track was holding the door, but the door was still open. The enemy was still out there. And these men, these veterans who had been fighting since Guadalcanal, who had been mocked and terrorized and pushed to the breaking point, they found something they thought they'd lost. They found their spine. Joey Marconi stopped running backward. He stood still, looked at the half-track, looked at the beam of fire cutting through the enemy, looked at his rifle lying in the mud 10 yards away where he'd dropped it. He walked over, picked it up, checked the action, loaded a fresh clip. "Fuck this," he said to no one in particular. "We ain't running." He dropped into a shell crater, raised his Garand, and started firing at the Japanese soldiers trying to reform on the far side of the clearing. To his left, another infantryman saw him and did the same. Then another, then another. One by one, the men who had been retreating in panic turned around and came back. The machine gun crews who had abandoned their jammed and overheated weapons ran back to their pits. They poured canteen water on the glowing barrels. They cleared the jammed bolts. They loaded fresh belts. The heavy guns came back into action, adding their steady thumping rhythm to the industrial roar of the Quad 50. The line was reforming. The spine of the American defense, which had snapped under the weight of the Banzai charge, was welding itself back together around the burning heart of the half-track. The tourist was holding the door. The real soldiers were coming back to help, but the half-track was dying. The barrels were glowing, not figuratively, literally glowing. Cherry red in the darkness, you could see the heat radiating off them in waves. A machine gun barrel is made of high-grade steel, but even the best steel has limits. When you fire hundreds of rounds through a barrel in rapid succession, the friction creates immense heat. The barrel can reach temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, metal begins to lose its temper. The carefully manufactured rifling inside the barrel, the spiral grooves that spin the bullet and give it stability, begins to wear away. When the rifling goes, the bullets stop spinning. When they stop spinning, they tumble. When they tumble, they fly off in random directions. Accuracy goes to hell, but accuracy wasn't the main problem. The main problem was cook-off. At extreme temperatures, the heat of the barrel alone can ignite the gunpowder in a chambered round before the bolt is fully locked. When that happens, the explosion occurs in the wrong part of the mechanism. The bolt can blow backward into the gunner's face, the barrel can split, the receiver can shatter, the gun becomes a grenade that kills its own crew. Frank saw the glow, saw all four barrels radiating heat like branding irons. They were well past the safe operating temperature, well past the point where any sane gunner would cease fire and let them cool. But if they stopped firing now, the Japanese would surge forward. The line would break again. Everyone would die. Frank grabbed a canteen from the rack, leaned out of the commander's position, exposing himself completely to enemy fire. Bullets were pinging off the armor plate, some of them so close he could feel the air displacement. He ignored them, unscrewed the canteen cap with shaking hands, poured the water directly onto the lower left gun barrel. The water hit the glowing metal and flashed instantly into steam with a violent hissing sound. A cloud of white fog erupted around the turret, momentarily obscuring everything. The barrel temperature dropped maybe 50 degrees. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough. They would need gallons of water to properly cool the guns, and they had maybe 3 more canteens. "Keep shooting!" Frank screamed over the roar. His voice was raw. "Burn them out if you have to." Marcus didn't let up, didn't even reduce his rate of fire. He kept the triggers fully depressed, hosing down the Japanese positions with continuous bursts. The tracers were starting to wobble as they left the barrels, the projectiles destabilizing from the worn rifling. But at ranges under 100 yards, it didn't matter. The volume of fire was so overwhelming that even tumbling bullets were hitting something. The Japanese were closer now. The survivors of the initial assault had regrouped and were making another push. They were learning. Instead of one massive wave, they were coming in smaller groups, trying to exploit any gap in the fire. They were close enough that Frank could see individual faces, could see the expression on the officer with the gold teeth as he screamed orders to his men, could see the young soldier, maybe 16 years old, face painted with mud and blood, running forward with a rifle that looked too big for him. A grenade landed near the front left track. The explosion was sharp and vicious. Shrapnel tore into the thin armor of the cab, puncturing the metal, ricocheting around inside. Eddie screamed something. Frank couldn't tell if it was pain or surprise or just his usual profanity. The half-track shuddered but kept moving, kept providing a stable platform. Then it happened. The sound changed. One of the 4 guns made a different noise, not the usual rhythmic hammering. A sharper crack followed by a grinding screech of tortured metal. The lower right gun had cooked off. A round had ignited in the chamber before the bolt locked. The explosion blew the bolt assembly backward, shearing off the locking lugs, rendering the gun completely inoperable. They were down to 3 guns. The cyclic rate dropped from 2,000 rounds per minute to 1,500. The beam of tracers became noticeably thinner. The Japanese saw the change, saw the opportunity. They surged forward with renewed energy, sensing weakness. Marcus compensated instantly, started traversing faster, sweeping the three remaining guns back and forth in wider arcs, trying to cover the same area with less firepower. Danny was screaming something incoherent, slamming fresh tombstones onto the three working guns, his hands black with blood and powder residue. The enemy was 30 yards away, 25 yards, close enough that Frank could see the details of their equipment, the leather straps of their ammunition pouches, the rising sun flags tied around their foreheads, the determination in their eyes. A group of grenade throwers surged forward. If even one grenade landed in the open turret basket, it was over. The explosion would kill the crew and silence the gun. The line would break. The Japanese would swarm through. Marcus saw them, didn't aim at their bodies, aimed at the ground in front of them. He used a technique that fighter pilots called the skip shot. He fired the 50 caliber rounds into the hard-packed mud of the road. The bullets hit the ground, traveling at 3,000 feet per second. Instead of burying themselves in the earth, they ricocheted upward at an angle, fragmenting as they bounced. The effect was like a horizontal claymore mine. A spray of bullet fragments and rock splinters scythed through the grenade throwers at knee and chest height. They went down, their grenades detonated uselessly in the mud where they fell. The Japanese charge wavered. The survivors were finally starting to understand this wasn't a fight they could win with spirit. This wasn't a battle where courage and determination would triumph over technology. They were running into a buzzsaw, and the buzzsaw wasn't jamming. Frank looked at the ammunition situation. Danny had just loaded the last full set of tombstones onto the three working guns. After this, they were dry. At 1,500 rounds per minute, 600 rounds would last 24 seconds, less than half a minute of fire. Then they would be reduced to throwing helmets and harsh language. "Last cans," Danny screamed. His voice was hoarse from smoke and shouting. "We're dry after this." Frank looked at the tree line. The Japanese were breaking. Actually breaking. The wall of bodies piled in front of the half-track was horrifyingly high. The survivors were looking back toward the jungle. The absolute conviction that had driven them forward was cracking. They were realizing that honor and spirit couldn't stop metal moving at 3,000 feet per second. "Pour it on," Frank yelled. "Finish it." Marcus depressed all three triggers simultaneously. The remaining guns screamed in unison, one final apocalyptic crescendo of fire. The red stream of tracers lashed out across the clearing, chasing the retreating figures back into the tree line. Trees exploded, the ground erupted, the air itself seemed to catch fire, and then abruptly silence. The belts were empty, the guns fell silent, the electric motors spun down with a fading whine. The only sounds left were the hiss of the superheated barrels cooling in the humid air and the high-pitched ringing in everyone's ears. Frank stood in the commander's position, M1, carbine in his hands, ready to fight hand to hand if they came back. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. His uniform was soaked through with sweat. His hands were shaking. He waited. The crew waited. The infantry in their foxholes waited. Everyone stared at the tree line, expecting the next wave, the final push, the endless enemy. Nothing came. The jungle was silent, completely silent. Even the insects had stopped. The only movement was the smoke drifting through the shattered trees and the flares slowly falling from the sky. The tiger had been declawed. Sunrise on January 15th, 1945 did not bring warmth to the jungle of Luzon. It brought visibility, and with visibility came understanding. As the gray light of dawn filtered through the smoke and shattered trees, the men of the 25th Infantry Division slowly emerged from their foxholes like survivors crawling from a shipwreck. They were ghosts. Faces caked with mud and dried blood, uniforms black with filth and powder residue, eyes sunken so deep into their skulls they looked like walking corpses. Some of them were shaking uncontrollably, adrenaline exhaustion setting in now that the terror had passed. Some moved with the jerky mechanical motions of men whose nervous systems had been overloaded beyond capacity. They checked themselves for wounds, patting down their bodies with trembling hands, stunned to discover they were still intact. Then they looked at the road. What they saw stopped the breath in their throats. The landscape had been fundamentally altered. The thick, tangled rainforest that had stood in front of their positions yesterday evening was gone. Not damaged, not thinned, gone, erased. The trees that remained standing looked like telephone poles stripped of their bark and branches sheared off at varying heights. The tallest was maybe 12 feet, most were shorter. They stood like tombstones in a graveyard, pale and skeletal against the morning sky. The undergrowth had been mowed to the mud. The 6-foot-tall kunai grass that had choked the clearing that had hidden enemy soldiers until they were practically on top of you had been cut down to bare earth. The vines that had connected tree to tree like jungle webbing had been severed into millions of small pieces that now carpeted the ground like confetti. You could see 100 yards in every direction. The jungle had been transformed into a clear field of fire. But it was the ground itself that told the true story. The bodies were not scattered randomly across the battlefield. They were concentrated located in specific zones, piled in heaps, where the interlocking fire from the 4 machine guns had converged. In some places, they were stacked 3 and 4 deep. The official body count when the graves registration teams finished their work 3 days later would record 617 confirmed enemy dead in the immediate area of Baker 3's position. But numbers on a page cannot capture what 617 human beings look like when they have been subjected to sustained 50 caliber machine gun fire. The infantrymen walked through the carnage, carefully weapons ready, checking bodies for signs of life. The ground was slick, not just with mud, with blood and other fluids that had soaked into the earth until it had the consistency of wet clay. The smell was already starting. Even in the cool morning air, the tropical heat would soon turn this place into something unbearable. The nearest Japanese bodies were found 11 yards from the front bumper of the half-track. 11 yards. They had gotten close enough to see the rivets on the armor plate, close enough to smell the gun smoke, but they had not been able to walk through that wall of metal. The physics had been too much, the kinetic energy too overwhelming. They had died reaching for something they could never touch. Among the dead was Colonel Takeshi Nakamura, identifiable by the sword still clutched in his hand and the insignia on his torn uniform. The commander who had believed that spirit could overcome American technology lay face down in the mud, his certainty proven catastrophically wrong. Frank Kowalski sat on the front bumper of his half-track rosary beads in his hands, staring at nothing. His face was black with soot. His eyes were red from smoke. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He was crying tears, cutting clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks, and he wasn't entirely sure why. Relief that he was alive. Horror at what he had done. Both. Neither. He had just killed somewhere north of 600 men in 30 minutes. With a machine his father would have understood, and he would do it again. That was the part that terrified him. If they came back tonight, he would load fresh belts and do it all over again without hesitation. What did that make him? Behind him, his crew was in various states of collapse. Eddie Sullivan sat in the driver's seat, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, chain-smoking cigarettes with hands that shook so badly he could barely get them lit. Marcus Hayes was methodically field-stripping the 3 working guns, checking for damage, his face expressionless as always, but Frank noticed his hands were shaking too. Even Marcus had limits. Danny Rossi sat on the floor of the fighting compartment, surrounded by ankle-deep brass casings, holding his hands up in front of his face. They were blistered and bleeding, the skin blackened from burns, and Danny was looking at them like they belonged to someone else. His lips were moving silently. Frank couldn't hear what he was saying, but he could read the words on the kid's lips. I'm sorry, Tony. I'm sorry, Tony. I'm sorry. The half-track itself was a wreck. The paint had been burned completely off the 3 working gun barrels, leaving them a pale bone-white color. The 4th barrel, the one that had cooked off, was visibly cracked near the receiver, a jagged split running halfway down its length. The grease that had lubricated the mount had been cooked into a black crust. The floor was buried under what looked like 1,000 pounds of spent brass casings. The weight of all that metal had actually compressed the suspension, making the vehicle sit lower on its tracks. And still they came. The infantrymen. One by one in pairs and small groups. They walked up to the half-track. They didn't speak. They just touched it, ran their hands over the cold steel of the armor, touched the burned barrels, stood next to it like pilgrims at a shrine. They weren't looking at a machine anymore. They were looking at the thing that had saved their lives. They were looking at a miracle made of steel and mathematics. Joey Marconi approached just after 0700 hours. He walked slowly through the field of bodies, rifle slung over his shoulder, face unreadable. He stopped 10 feet from the half-track, looked at Frank, looked at the guns, looked at the landscape. His jaw was working like he was trying to chew something tough. Frank looked up. Their eyes met. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Finally, Joey took 3 more steps forward. Then, to Frank's complete shock, he dropped to his knees in the mud, put both hands on the cold steel of the track, pressed his forehead against the metal. His shoulders were shaking. "Sarge," Joey said. His voice was thick, choked. "I spit on you. I called you a coward. I called you a tourist. I said you weren't a real soldier, and you... He couldn't finish. The words broke apart into something that might have been a sob. Frank stood up slowly. His legs were stiff. His back hurt. Everything hurt. He walked over and put a hand on Joey's shoulder. "Forget it, Private. We all got a job. You do yours, I do mine." Joey looked up. His face was streaked with tears, cutting through the mud. "What you did, that wasn't your job. The manual says you should have run. You broke the rules. You could get court-martialed, and you did it anyway. You did it for us." Frank didn't know what to say to that. He had broken the rules. He had violated doctrine. He had committed what was technically insubordination, and he would do it again, had to do it again, because the manual was wrong and the men in the foxholes were right, and sometimes you had to choose between the rules and doing what was right. "Get up, Joey," Frank said quietly. "You got nothing to apologize for. You were out there in the mud doing the real fighting." I just gave you some covering fire. Joey stood, stuck out his hand. Frank took it. They shook, and in that moment, something changed. The tourist was gone. The birdwatcher was gone. Something else had taken their place. Other infantrymen were gathering now, a dozen, 20. They stood in a loose circle around the half-track, looking at it, looking at Frank and his crew. No one was mocking now. No one was laughing. They had seen what this machine could do. They had seen 4 men hold a line against a regiment. They had seen the impossible become real. A staff sergeant that Frank didn't recognize stepped forward. He snapped to attention, saluted. Sergeant Kowalski, on behalf of Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 25th Infantry Division, I want to say thank you. You saved our lives. All of us. Frank returned the salute awkwardly, but just doing my job, Sergeant. No, sir. You did way more than your job. You did something nobody thought was possible. The circle of infantrymen began to break up, but as they left, each man made a point of touching the half-track, putting a hand on the armor, a gesture of respect, almost religious. The machine had become sacred. Captain Robert Clayton arrived at 0730 hours. He walked through the carnage with his face carefully neutral, stopped at the half-track, looked at the destroyed gun barrel, looked at the spent brass covering the floor, looked at Frank standing there covered in soot and shame and exhaustion. Sergeant Kowalski, Clayton said formally, did I order you to advance into that breach last night? This was the moment. Court-martial or commendation, career or prison. Frank knew that Clayton was offering him an out, offering to take responsibility, but Frank also knew that he had made the choice. He had pulled the trigger, literally and figuratively. Yes, sir, Frank said, you did. Clayton held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Good. That's what I'll tell the colonel. Well done, Sergeant. Get your crew some rest. You've earned it. He turned to leave, then stopped, looked back. Sergeant, your father would be proud. Frank didn't trust himself to speak, just nodded. But the reckoning wasn't over. 20 minutes later, a jeep arrived carrying a lieutenant colonel that Frank had never seen before, accompanied by 2 MPs. Frank's heart sank. This was it. The arrest. The court-martial. He had known it was coming. The lieutenant colonel stepped out of the jeep. He was thin, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the look of a staff officer who spent his war behind a desk. He walked up to Frank, looked him up and down, and said the last thing Frank expected. Sergeant Kowalski, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Peters from Division S2, Intelligence. I need you to tell me everything you did last night, every detail, ammunition selection, traverse patterns, rate of fire, target selection, everything. We're rewriting the tactical doctrine for anti-aircraft employment, and you just provided the field test data. Frank blinked. Sir, you're not in trouble, Sergeant. Well, technically you are, but nobody gives a damn. You just solved a problem that's been killing us since Guadalcanal, the Banzai charge problem. Every island, same story. They mass up and charge, we shoot until the barrels melt. Sometimes they break through anyway. But you stopped a regimental strength assault with 4 men in 1 vehicle. High command wants to know how. More importantly, they want to know if we can do it again. Over the next 2 hours, Frank walked Colonel Peters through every decision he had made. The 50% tracer load for night visibility, the decision to lower the guns and fire flat, the traverse patterns Marcus had used, the ammunition consumption rate, the barrel temperature problem, and how they had managed it. Peters wrote everything down in a small notebook, asking questions, clarifying details, treating Frank like an expert consultant rather than an insubordinate sergeant. One more question, Peters said. The manual says anti-aircraft vehicles should never be deployed forward of the infantry line. Given your experience, do you agree with that assessment? Frank thought about the 617 bodies, thought about Joey Marconi kneeling in the mud, thought about the 482 men who had lived. No, sir, he said quietly. I don't agree with it at all. Peters smiled. It was a thin smile, but genuine. Good, because as of 0800 this morning, that section of the manual has been suspended pending revision. Every regiment in the Philippines is requesting Quad 50 support. The supply depots are being raided. We're pulling every M16 out of storage and sending them to the line. You just changed how we fight this war, Sergeant. I hope you understand that. Frank didn't feel like he had changed anything. He felt like he had killed 600 men and would spend the rest of his life trying to figure out if he was a hero or a murderer or both. The new name spread through the division like wildfire. By the afternoon of January 15th, nobody was calling it the Birdwatcher anymore. Nobody was calling it the anti-aircraft half-track. The infantrymen had given it a new designation, and the name stuck with the cold accuracy of men who had seen what it could do. The meat chopper. It was brutal. It was ugly. It was honest. The name reflected the terrifying reality of what the Quad 50 did to human beings at close range. It ground them up. It erased them. It turned formations into debris. The name was born in blood and fear and gratitude, and it would follow the vehicle for the rest of the war. By January 20th, 5 days after the battle, every infantry regiment on Luzon had at least one meat chopper attached to it. The M16s were pulled from their air defense positions and deployed directly to the front lines. The doctrine had been completely rewritten. Anti-aircraft assets were now explicitly authorized for ground support missions. The manual that Frank had violated was being thrown out and replaced with new procedures based entirely on his actions. On February 4th, another Banzai charge hit an American position near the town of Munoz. This time, 2 meat choppers were waiting. The Japanese assault lasted 7 minutes before it collapsed. Estimated enemy casualties, 400 plus. American casualties, 12 wounded, none killed. The half-track crews had learned from Frank's experience. They had better cooling procedures, better ammunition distribution, better tactical positioning, but the core concept was the same. Point the sky gun at the ground and let physics do the rest. By March, the Japanese stopped using Banzai charges entirely on Luzon. The tactic that had terrified American forces since Guadalcanal, that had broken lines and overrun positions through sheer fanatical determination, was obsolete, not because the Japanese had lost their courage, because the mathematics of 50 caliber machine guns fired at ground level were too brutal to overcome. Spirit could not defeat kinetic energy. Bushido could not stop steel moving at 3,000 feet per second. Frank watched it happen from a distance. He and his crew stayed together through the rest of the Luzon campaign, but they never fired their guns in anger again. The Japanese learned to avoid areas where meat choppers were positioned. They changed their tactics. They dug deeper. They fought from caves and bunkers instead of charging in the open. The war went on, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, but the nature of the fighting had changed. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios across the Pacific announcing Japan's surrender. Frank was in Manila when he heard the news. The city exploded in celebration. Men were crying, laughing, shooting their rifles in the air, getting drunk on whatever they could find. The war was over. They were going home. Frank sat in his half-track hand on the cold metal of the gun mount and felt nothing. No joy, no relief, just a vast emptiness where something used to be. Eddie was crying. Marcus had walked away and come back an hour later with red eyes. Danny got drunk for the first time in his life, all 17 years of it, and threw up behind the motor pool. But Frank just sat there touching the machine that had saved 482 lives and taken 617 others, and wondered what peace was going to feel like after this. 2 weeks before they shipped home, a Japanese-American translator from the Military Intelligence Service found Frank in the motor pool. The man was young, maybe 25, with the armband of a staff sergeant. Sergeant Kowalski, I have something for you. We interrogated a Japanese officer who survived your engagement. Colonel Takeshi Nakamura. He died of his wounds 3 days ago, but before he passed, he asked me to deliver a message. Frank's hand stopped moving on the gun he was cleaning. What message? He said, and I quote, "Tell the Polish sergeant with the fire dragon that he fought with honor. I failed my men by underestimating American ingenuity. That is why we lost the war," end quote. The translator handed Frank a small piece of paper with Japanese characters written in careful script, and below it the English translation. Then he saluted and walked away. Frank stood there holding the enemy commander's final words, and he didn't know if they made him feel better or worse. They shipped home in October. The voyage back across the Pacific took 3 weeks. Frank stood at the rail every night looking at the stars, trying to find the words for the letter he still hadn't sent his mother, the letter explaining what he had done, what he had become. On the 4th night, Danny found him there. "Sarge, can I ask you something?" "Sure, kid." "Do you think Tony would be proud of me using his name, loading those guns? All of it." Frank looked at the boy, still just 17, still had the baby fat in his cheeks, had lied his way into a war and survived it through sheer determination and bleeding hands. "Your brother earned his Bronze Star on Omaha Beach fighting for his country," Frank said. "You earned yours on Luzon loading ammunition while the world burned." "Yeah, Danny, I think he'd be proud. I think he'd be damn proud." Danny nodded, wiped his eyes, started to leave, then stopped. "Sarge, you ever wonder if we're going to be okay after all this?" Frank thought about the 617 bodies, thought about the sound of the guns, thought about the smell and the screams and the way the jungle had looked when the sun came up, thought about how he would do it all again if he had to. "I don't know, kid," he said honestly. I really don't know." But Frank Kowalski wasn't done with war. Not yet. 5 years later, in November of 1950, the phone rang in Frank's small house in Detroit. He was 33 years old now, married to a girl named Ruth from his old neighborhood, 2 kids, Michael and Patricia, working at the Ford plant like his father before him, trying to build a normal life, trying to forget. The voice on the other end was crisp and military. "Sergeant Kowalski, this is Colonel Peters. I don't know if you remember me." "I remember, sir." "Good. I need you. We all need you. Korea is burning up, and the Chinese are doing to our boys exactly what the Japanese did to us. Human wave attacks. Thousands of men charging into the guns. We're getting overrun. We need the meat chopper doctrine, and we need instructors who know how to use it. Will you come back?" Frank looked across the kitchen at Ruth, who was watching him with fearful eyes, looked at the photograph on the wall of his father at the Ford plant, looked at his hands, which still shook sometimes in his sleep. His mother, Helena, was visiting. She sat at the kitchen table, her rosary in her hands, the same rosary she had given him in 1941. She looked at him and said quietly, "Your father's machine failed him. Your machine saved people. Go teach them to save more." Frank reported to Fort Lewis in December. By January of 1951, he was in Korea with the rank of Master Sergeant assigned to train anti-aircraft crews in ground support tactics. The Quad 50s had been pulled out of storage again. The meat choppers were going back to war. The Chosin Reservoir in December of 1950 was hell frozen over. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. Chinese forces attacked in massive waves using the same Banzai tactics the Japanese had perfected. And waiting for them were the Quad 50s now operated by crews Frank had personally trained. The results were identical to Luzon. The human waves broke against the wall of 50 caliber fire. The Chinese learned, just as the Japanese had learned, that courage and numbers could not overcome physics. The attacks stopped. The tactics changed. The meat chopper had done its job again, but Frank wasn't on the gun this time. He was behind the lines training younger crews, watching them handle the terrible mathematics of trading bullets for bodies, watching them win, watching them pay the price afterward. He saw his own ghosts reflected in their eyes. He came home in 1951 and never talked about Korea, never talked about the Philippines, never told his children what he had done. He locked it away in a place so deep that sometimes he almost forgot it himself. Almost. August of 2003. Frank Kowalski was 87 years old. His wife Ruth had died 5 years earlier. He lived in a nursing home in Dearborn, Michigan, in a small room with a window overlooking a parking lot. Most days were the same: breakfast, pills, television, lunch, more pills, dinner, sleep. The war was 60 years gone. Most of the men he had served with were dead. The world had moved on. Then his grandson Michael came to visit, 16 years old, smart kid, doing a family history project for school. He had found Frank's discharge papers in a box in his mother's attic. "Grandpa," Michael said, holding up the faded documents, "you have a Bronze Star. What did you do to earn it?" Frank looked at the papers, looked at the boy, thought about 617 bodies and 482 saved lives, and the sound of canvas ripping and the smell of burning jungle. "I sat in a truck," he said. "Come on, Grandpa, really?" Frank sighed. "You really want to know?" "Yes, sir." "Then I'll show you." They drove to the Detroit Historical Museum the next day. Michael pushed Frank's wheelchair through the main gallery, past the Model T exhibit, past the Diego Rivera murals, to the back corner where they kept the World War II collection. And there, sitting under dusty lights, tires flat and paint faded, was an M16 multiple gun motor carriage with an M45 Maxon quad mount, not Frank's vehicle. That one had been scrapped decades ago, melted down for washing machines and car parts. But the same model, the same configuration, the same weapon that had changed Frank's life and ended 617 others. The placard read M16 multiple gun motor carriage, anti-aircraft weapon, also used in ground roll in Philippines and Korea. Most visitors walked right past it, too interested in the Sherman tanks and the P-51 Mustang hanging from the ceiling. But Frank stopped his wheelchair and stared. "That's it?" Michael asked. "That's what you used?" "That's it." Frank told him the story then. Not all of it. He didn't mention the smell or the sounds or the nightmares that still woke him up 60 years later. But he told him about Joey Marconi spitting on the tracks, about Captain Clayton's impossible order, about driving into the breach, about Marcus and Eddie and Danny, about the night the jungle burned. When he finished, Michael was quiet for a long time. "Grandpa, do you think you did the right thing disobeying orders?" Frank reached out and touched the cold steel of the half-track. Same metal, same machine, different war, different men, but the same choice. "Son, the manual said I should protect my machine. I chose to protect my friends. I'd make that choice again every time." He paused. His hand was shaking against the metal. "But it cost something. Don't ever think it didn't cost something." Michael nodded slowly. "What did it cost?" Frank was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. 60 years of wondering if I'm a hero or a murderer. 60 years of seeing their faces every time I close my eyes. 60 years of knowing that I saved lives by taking lives and never being sure if the math works out in the end. The museum curator, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, had been listening from a respectful distance. She approached carefully. "Excuse me, sir, I couldn't help but overhear. Were you actually there in the Philippines?" "Yes, ma'am." "Would you be willing to record an oral history for our archives? We have so few first-hand accounts of the Quad 50 cruise." Frank shook his head. "No, ma'am. I appreciate it, but no." "I understand." She hesitated. "You might be interested to know that we actually have the combat logs from the 209th AAA Battalion in our research library. I could pull them if you'd like to see them." "Why would I want to see those?" "Because according to the logs, a Sergeant F. Kowalski was recommended for the Medal of Honor in January of 1945 for breaking an enemy regimental assault and saving divisional positions. The paperwork was apparently lost in the chaos of the war's end. By the time someone found it in 1946 and sent it through channels, you'd already made it clear you didn't want recognition. The recommendation was quietly filed away." Frank stared at her. "I never knew that." "A lot of men refused. The ones who did the real fighting usually did." She smiled gently. The placard is wrong, It's not just an anti-aircraft weapon used in a ground roll. Based on what you just told your grandson, it's something much more important than that. 3 months later, in November of 2003, Frank Kowalski died in his sleep in the nursing home, lung cancer. The doctor said it was probably from asbestos exposure at the Ford plant. They held the funeral at St. Florian's Church in Detroit, the same church where his father's funeral had been held 65 years earlier. It was a small service. Most of Frank's generation was gone. His children were there. His grandchildren, some neighbors. The priest said kind words about a quiet man who had worked hard and loved his family. Then, just as the service was ending, two old men in wheelchairs came through the door. One was pushed by his son. The other navigated his electric wheelchair with gnarled hands, Joey Marconi, 82 years old, still from South Philadelphia, still mean looking even in a suit. And Danny Rossi, 75 years old, hands still scarred from that night in January of 45. They had stayed in touch with each other over the years, but had lost contact with Frank decades ago. They had seen the obituary in the Veterans newsletter. They had come. Eddie Sullivan had died in 1989 lung cancer from a lifetime of Lucky Strikes. Marcus Hayes had passed in 1997, quiet to the end, buried in Chicago next to the wife he'd married in 1946. But two members of the crew were still alive, and they had come. They wheeled up to the casket, American flag draped over it. Both men struggled to stand. Their children helped them. They stood on shaking legs in front of Frank's coffin and snapped to attention, the best attention their ancient bodies could manage. And they saluted. Joey's voice was rough with age and emotion. The Polak saved my life. Danny's voice was softer. He saved all of us. They stood there for a long moment, two old soldiers saying goodbye to a third, and in that moment the people in the church understood that whatever Frank Kowalski had done in the war, it had mattered. It had mattered enough that two men had traveled hundreds of miles in wheelchairs just to say thank you one last time. At the cemetery, as they lowered Frank into the ground next to Ruth, a young man in an army dress uniform approached Michael. He was a colonel, retired, Silver Eagles on his shoulders, even though he wore civilian clothes. You're Frank's grandson. Yes, sir. I'm Robert Clayton Jr. My father commanded your grandfather in the Philippines. He died in '87, but before he passed, he gave me something to hold until this day came. He handed Michael a wooden box. Inside was Frank's bronze star, the one he had earned but never displayed, and underneath it was a letter yellowed with age, written in careful script. Michael will not remember me, but when he is old enough to understand, give him this. His grandfather taught me that sometimes the right thing to do is the wrong thing, according to the book. I spent 40 years in the Army remembering that lesson. Tell him that Frank Kowalski was the best soldier I ever commanded, not because he followed orders, because he knew when orders were wrong and had the courage to do what was right instead. The cost of that courage was high. Frank paid it every day for 60 years. That's the real heroism, not the 30 minutes of glory, the 60 years of carrying the weight. Remember him for both. Captain Robert Clayton, U.S. Army retired, 1987. Michael stood in the cold November wind holding his grandfather's bronze star and finally understood what the old man had meant about cost. Present day, 2024, the Detroit Historical Museum has been renovated. The World War II exhibit has been expanded. And in the center of the room, under professional lighting, sits the M16 multiple gun motor carriage. The placard has been updated. Michael Kowalski, now a history professor at the University of Michigan, donated money for the restoration and the new display. It reads M16 multiple gun motor carriage, the meat chopper. On January 15, 1945, Sergeant Frank Kowalski of the 209th AAA Battalion violated direct orders and deployed this vehicle against a Japanese Banzai charge near Luzon, Philippines. In 30 minutes of combat, his four-person crew broke a regimental strength assault and saved 482 American lives. Kowalski's actions led to the complete revision of U.S. Army anti-aircraft doctrine. The M16, designed to destroy aircraft, became the most effective anti-infantry weapon in the Pacific theater. The tactic was repeated successfully in Korea against Chinese human wave attacks. Sergeant Kowalski refused the Medal of Honor, stating, "I didn't do anything special. The machine did the work." But the 482 men who survived that night knew better. The machine was powerful. The man who wielded it was brave, and the cost of that bravery was carried for a lifetime. This weapon changed how America fights. Remember both its power and its price. Every semester, Michael brings his students here. They stand in front of the half-track, and he tells them the story. Not the sanitized version, the real version, about the smell and the sound and the 617 bodies and the 60 years of nightmares, about courage and cost and the impossible choices war forces on ordinary men. Was your grandfather a hero? A student asks. Michael looks at the half-track, touches the cold steel the same way his grandfather did, the same way Joey Marconi did, the same way thousands of infantrymen did in January of 1945. He was a man who made an impossible choice, Michael says quietly. He saved lives by taking lives. He broke the rules to do what was right, and he paid for it every day for the rest of his life. Whether that makes him a hero, I think that's a question everyone has to answer for themselves. But I know this. He did what he thought was right, and he carried the weight of that choice until the day he died. Maybe that's what heroism really is. Not the moment of action, the lifetime of living with the consequences. The students walk away to look at other exhibits. The museum closes, the lights dim, and the meat chopper sits in the darkness, silent and still remembering the night the jungle burned and the machine became legend, and one man traded his piece for 482 lives he would never meet. The price was high. Frank paid it willingly, and the debt was never forgotten.